Good morning and thank you all for joining. We'll just take a few seconds to let everyone, give everyone a chance to enter the room. We're so excited that so many of you are interested in this topic and are able to share a bit of your morning with us. You'll notice that you are muted. It will stay like that throughout the remainder of today's webinar, but you will have a chance to ask questions. If at any point during today's session, you have an issue with video or audio, please use the chat box. I'll be available to assist you. And lastly, this is just a quick note. We will make this recording available at the end of today's session. You'll receive an email with a recording link either the end of today or tomorrow. Again, we thank you all for joining. I'm going to take this time and pass it over to Tom.
Thank you very much, Jasmine. Good morning and welcome everyone. I am Tom Toch. I'm Director of Future Ed at Georgetown University's McCourt School of Public Policy. We are very pleased to partner with the Southern Regional Education Board to host today's webinar on the American Rescue Plan's elementary and secondary emergency relief and other federal pandemic response funding for the nation's schools. Congress and the Trump and Biden administrations have provided states and local education agencies with an unprecedented infusion of federal funding to help them respond to the equally unprecedented challenges created by the coronavirus pandemic. Nearly $300 billion in 3 relief packages since March 2020. For perspective, that's the equivalent of a roughly 45% increase in the US elementary and secondary education systems annual operating budget. The money presents tremendous opportunities for education policymakers and practitioners and enormous challenges. We're very fortunate to have 3 experts with us this morning to discuss both sides of that equation. Denise Ford is Senior Vice President for Partnerships and Engagement at the Education Trust. She is a former staff director of the House Committee on Education and the Workforce, and she held senior roles in the U.S. Department of Education's Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development in the Obama administration. Stephen Pruitt is president of the Southern Regional Education Board. He served as Kentucky's State Commissioner of Education and held several leadership positions in the Georgia Department of Education, including Chief of Staff and Associate State Superintendent for Assessment and Accountability. And we're also very fortunate to have with us Ian Rosenblum, who is the Biden administration's acting assistant secretary in the Office of Elementary and Secondary Education at the U.S. Department of Education, where he leads the department's work to help states and districts deploy federal COVID education aid. So we're going to spend the first portion of our hour discussing the federal funding initiatives with Denise, Stephen, and Ian, and then we'll get to as many audience questions as possible, and we may even go a little bit over our 12 o'clock end date, our end time, just to give folks as much opportunity as possible to answer questions. So please submit your questions in the Q&A tab on your screens, and we'll make sure we get to as many as we can. Do not submit them in the chat, please. Put them in the Q&A because that's how we're set up to handle them this morning. So Ian, can you start us off at a high level? What is the federal school aid from March 2020, December 2020, and the recently enacted American Rescue Plan intended to accomplish?
Sure. Well, first, thanks so much for the opportunity to be part of this conversation. Broadly, all of these resources are rooted in an understanding of the extraordinary work that's been done at the state and the local level by educators, by policymakers, by students and families to support the needs of students during these extraordinarily difficult circumstances. And the reality that resources are necessary. And so statutorily, all of these funds are dedicated to preventing, preparing for, and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. And what that really means is that they can be used for a wide range of critical investments that include ensuring the safe reopening of school buildings, maintaining their safe operations to support in-person instruction, and critically, addressing the social, emotional, and academic needs of students, and in particular, those groups of students who've been most impacted by the pandemic. And so when we think about the American Rescue Plan in particular, it includes $130 billion in funding for K-12 education, and it really emphasizes the needs of those students who have been historically underserved and then most impacted by the pandemic. We'll talk today about the $122 billion Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund, commonly called ARP-ESSER. And I just want to flag before talking about that's only one piece of the critical resources in the American Rescue Plan. For example, it also includes $800 million in support for students experiencing homelessness, who of course have been significantly and specifically impacted by the pandemic. And so all of these resources together are critical to making sure not only that we're able to safely reopen and sustain the operations of our school buildings, but that we're able going forward to urgently meet the needs of students and provide them with the robust supports that they need. I'm happy to talk a little more about some of the specific parts of the ESSER fund and how that works.
Sure, thanks. So tell us how, when, and to whom does the ARP's elementary and secondary emergency relief money get distributed?
Sure. So let me start by just talking a little bit about the structure of the fund. So of the nearly $122 billion is allocated first to states. And there are some specific state set-asides in the legislation. So states are required to use at least 5% of the funds that they receive to address the academic impacts of lost instructional time, what some people call learning loss, at least 1% to fund summer learning and enrichment programs, and at least 1% for comprehensive after-school programs. All of those are evidence-based programs that need to be intentionally designed to provide targeted support to the students most impacted by the pandemic. And so there's a focus on evidence, and there's a focus on educational equity that is core to thinking about the law. Beyond that, more than 90% of the funds, at least 90% of the funds, go to LEAs, go to school districts. And those funds can be used by school districts for a range of critical needs, including that at least 20% are set aside to support, to address the academic impact of lost instructional time, including meeting the social, emotional, and academic needs of students. And so there's really critical investment at the state level, and then a strong infusion of funds at the local level. We've made 2/3 of the resources, $81 billion, available to states already for their immediate use, recognizing the urgency of getting these funds to work. And so those are resources that states are hopefully allocating right now to their LEAs and using at the state level, planning for things like robust summer learning and enrichment programs. And then we've announced that we'll have an application so that states can share with the public their plan for the use of all of these funds. And then once those applications are approved, the final 1/3 will be released.
Great. And the monies go to traditional public schools, public charter schools, and private and parochial schools too, correct? So
the $122 billion ARP-ESSER fund goes to states and to LEAs. And LEAs, depending on the state, can include charter schools. The needs of non-public schools are addressed through a separate fund called the Emergency Assistance for Non-Public Schools, or EANS fund, which has the state being able to provide services to support specific pandemic-related needs in non-public schools. And that under the American Rescue Plan is targeted to non-public schools that serve a significant share of students from low-income families and that have been most impacted by the pandemic.
All right, great, thanks. So who decides how the money gets spent? Is this something that states dictate, or does it work differently from state to state?
So generally, school districts are the entity that have the most to say about how their share, the at least 90% of the allocations, are used. And that's because the law specifically spells out the allowable uses of the funds for school districts. States have a critical role in the uses of funds for the set-asides that I described on addressing the academic impact of lost instructional time, summer learning and enrichment, and after school program, as well as funding for other emergency needs. And we believe it's critical that they support school districts in thinking through the planning process more broadly for the use of these funds, so that we can really be sure that they'll be used effectively, that they'll be used for the intended purposes, and that they'll be used to address the critical educational equity needs.
Great. So the ARP requires that 20% of the district monies, 20% of roughly 90%, need to be used to address learning loss. And it requires that states and districts spend money on so-called evidence-based initiatives to do that. How should policymakers and practitioners interpret the concept evidence-based?
Yeah, so the concept of evidence-based is really critical here, because this is obviously a very significant level of funding, and we want to make sure that it's able to achieve its intended goal, which is to support the social, emotional, and academic needs of students, and again, to do so with a focus on the students most impacted by the pandemic. And so thinking about evidence-based strategies, which there's a wide range of what counts as evidence-based strategies under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, is an important way to ensure that states and school districts are having critical conversations about what interventions are most appropriate, which are likely to work, and how they're going to measure it. And we think those are really critical conversations for states and school districts to be having, and for the federal government to be in a position to support.
Just quickly, where do folks find that list of so-called evidence-based initiatives?
So there's a lot of places that you could look for the list. One that I would highlight is just this past, well, I don't really remember what day it is, but I think earlier this week or the very end of last week, the department published what we're calling Volume 2 of our COVID handbook. Volume 1 really focused on prevention and mitigation strategies aligned with Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's operating plan for K-12 schools. And Volume 2 focuses on a critical set of educational opportunities to address student needs through an equity lens. And so I would suggest looking at that handbook and taking a look at some of its suggestions for really important strategies. And that's on the department's website at ed.gov.
Great, thanks. I'd love to bring Denise and Stephen into the conversation. What do you see as evidence-based investments that states and districts would be smart to make to respond to learning loss?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and thanks for having me here today. Excited to hear from others and to learn from this great group. I mean, look, what Ian just shared with you is a big deal. No one should understate the fact that we are looking at a large investment to support, and I'm also so glad he said that, the social, emotional, and academic needs of kids who have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic. But as much as we desperately need that funding, we also want to be able to spend it well, and on what we spend those dollars is critically important, and spending it in mind with the equity levers that we know are going to drive impact for the communities who have deeply felt both the health pandemic and the anti-racism is really important. So a couple of things that Ed Trust has been weighing in on, and we recently released several briefs talking about evidence-based strategies to support the interrupted learning that so many students experience, really revolve around the importance of intensive tutoring and where that works best and for whom, which are also big decisions that school districts need to think about. We know that intensive tutoring works really well for younger kids in very small groups, but for older kids, it may look a little different. And in most cases, you're going to want to make sure, actually in all cases, that there are these supportive relationships, right? The people who are doing the tutoring have the ability to support these children and support them in all of their needs, not just academically, but through social and emotional needs as well. And then the other thing that was targeted in the ARP, which we also think is really important, is for folks to start thinking about the when we're going to deliver this, meaning how you do it both during the school day or after the school day, as well as through summer programs. I mean, the urgency right now is for school districts to be thinking about the infrastructure that's going to be needed for summer to do that well and to make sure that we are getting to as many students as possible during that time. And let me just speak to two other things here. All of this is going to need great people to surround our kids, right? Great people. And great people usually means we're going to need some intensive training to go on with this, whether it's your college student, whether it's a paraprofessional, whether it's even a regular classroom teacher. They're going to need some enhanced professional development in an ongoing fashion to make sure that we are delivering these supports well. And then the other thing is we have not, gotten past the stage where all kids have the devices that they need, the infrastructure that they need to continue, learning. We need to make sure that's happening. We need to make sure we have innovative staffing models. We want to really make sure that at this particular time that the pedagogy is also culturally affirming. So there are a lot of things out there. I would definitely point you to Ian to ed.gov to identify other places where you can find great practices. Tom at Future Ed has been working on this. Number of great groups have been really giving good thought to what are evidence-based strategies that we can deploy now to make sure that the impact of this pandemic is not long lasting.
Thanks, Denise. That's really helpful. Stephen, what are you suggesting to your member states and the practitioners in those states regarding smart evidence-based investments in responding to learning loss?
Thanks, Tom. And I just want to thank the whole panel. Such great information already. And we just really appreciate you taking time to be with us today. From our perspective at SREB, we're sort of taking some practical perspectives on it. I would start by simply giving a caution to our friends out there in the field that as you're thinking about this, there's not going to be a silver bullet. There's not going to be something that you could just go buy off the shelf, even though there may be those who claim that. I kind of jokingly say all the time, be careful of the silver bullet because it just means there's a werewolf around because that's about the only good use for it. What we are guiding our states on is before you jump into purchasing, you need to really have a thoughtful plan for how you've identified what your needs are. Human nature is let's immediately go spend the money. Let's go buy something. If you buy 500 iPads because you want to be one-to-one, but you haven't considered what I call the total cost of ownership, which includes all the things that both Ian and Denise have already talked about, the devices, the maintenance of the devices, the storage of the devices, the training of the teachers, then basically you've bought 500 paperweights. And so what we really are pushing, and actually we'll be releasing a document called the Education Recovery Process Guide next week on the 21st. And in that, it walks people through how do you think about setting priorities before you actually purchase? What are the things that you need to consider around, first of all, ensuring that you have a stable environment, that you have that you're addressing immediate needs, both social and health and academic. And then how do you set up a feedback loop to ensure that you are measuring efficacy, making sure that the stuff is actually working. You can buy all the things in the world, but if it's not actually affecting a child, then why do you continue to spend that money? And then an accountability loop that somebody is actually watching and paying attention to how those funds are being spent. For us, the evidence base needs to be in part focused on is what you're purchasing really going to meet the needs that you have set out and that you've thought through. Often we say to people, ask the question why 5 times before you make a decision about your priorities, so you can really get down to what those root causes are.
Yeah, thanks. backward mapping seems to be particularly important in this moment, given the need on the one hand and the level of resources on the other. Denise, the ARP stipulates that states, quote, address the pandemic's disproportionate impact on underrepresented student subgroups, unquote. And Ian stressed this too. How do you, in your view, should states and districts act on that directive? How should they spend money through an equity lens, if you will?
Two things. We have to have the data first, and we have to know where those disparities are from that data. And then the plan, that Ian talked about. First, let me talk about the data though. Look, I think we have been very short-sighted about data for a very long time across the country. Not a lot of states took advantage of the state longitudinal data system or took advantage of, really embraced on how to do it well. And sadly, I think that could have an impact on the how we do figure out how to spend the dollars and spend them well and on what, because we won't fully know where some of these inequities are without having the data available to us. So I would strongly encourage states and local leaders to really dig into the data available. Let's try to make sure we get a handle on who has been missing from the classroom, how many times they've logged on, how long they've logged on, whether that's in-person learning or remote learning. Do they have devices at home? Some of that critical stuff that might not necessarily be picked up through, diagnostic informative assessments. We should be looking for all sources of data that are going to uncover for us where some of the deep inequities have, they've been there, but the pandemic has really shined a light on it. Get in touch with the homeless coordinator. Like, let's get a sense of who is homeless that's out there. Let's understand what's going on with our kids who are in the foster care system. Let's really get a handle on whether, our EL kids, our English learners, have access to whether it's a platform that has been translated or in-person learning. But we are not going to be able to spend this money well and know that we have an impact unless we start with the data. So starting there, and then the next thing, to really encourage equitable spending and do it with an equity focus, you have to have folks from the community involved in that. And so engaging stakeholders up front is also going to be critically important, and being very transparent about how you do that. And one of the reasons that we really, highlight the need to partner with community-based organizations as you're engaging stakeholders is they've been working with communities for so long, and they actually are going to be more likely to have access to some of the kids that may have been lost from school. They actually may be working with them. And the other thing I think that we really need to get a handle on if we want to do this to ensure that the impact is going to be long lasting is to really make sure that there's good guidance for districts and schools that identify what are the evidence-based strategies and how to do it so that it's not just effective, but equitable. And I think the department and this new administration are looking to be partners in that. And I'm super excited about that. But then we also have great folks at SREB and also at EdTrust ready to help you think through some of this. So again, this is the right way to be thinking about how we're spending those dollars.
Thanks. Stephen, Denise shared with us several different types of information that would be valuable to district administrators in particular. She didn't mention standardized testing. In your sense of how states and districts should address the disproportionate impact on underrepresented student groups, is standardized testing part of that equation?
Absolutely. I mean, I know right now everybody's saying that they don't want to see the tests, but I am of the belief that our standardized test is one of the big flashlights that we have to provide more information about the inequities of how students are performing. I think it's important. I do think that I've been referring to this year as the year of the asterisks. It's not a year that we want to see necessarily a lot of accountability with those test scores, but I do think they're important. But I also think that we're at a point where, given this level of change, this level of opportunity, we should also be thinking past those test scores. So what else about our accountability systems should we be looking to tell us the quality of education that students are getting? If we pull all of our students out of the things that give them hope, like the arts and science and social studies, just to give them 8 hours of math and reading, it may help a test score, but it probably won't do what they need to do to actually further them in their educational pursuits. I think that we're at a place where this achievement is always going to be one of those things that has to come first. And standardized testing gives us a great insight into that. But I think that if we really invest this at this point, we address things like what I call assessment illiteracy, where people have a better understanding of actually how to assess students at the local level. We leverage tools that we already have. We provide opportunities for teachers to have training on actually how to use those results, how to get together and develop a plan after the results. Denise hit the nail on the head. The data is huge, but through this equity lens, my belief is if we do all those things, great, but we need on the front end, a plan for how we will do these different components of data and planning, or data and assessment, so that they do make a difference. It's one thing to do it. It's another to have a plan and deliberately put equity into the plan. If you don't put it in there, it's easy to say. In fact, I've always heard people say, oh, equity is our overarching concept. What I learned a long time ago, especially as a former science teacher, when people say, yeah, we're integrating science across the curriculum, what that really meant is I said the word science and therefore it was there. And often I think that's what happens with equity. I think you've got to have a very deliberate plan about how to use this data, the state assessments and local assessments, and then how that will translate into better instruction for our most needy students.
Great, thanks. So relatedly, the ARP includes so-called maintenance of equity and maintenance of effort provisions. Ian, can you explain those for us?
Sure, and both of these are really critical provisions, particularly maintenance of equity, which is a new provision, really should be credited to a lot of work by civil rights and equity organizations and to champions on the Hill who've been working towards that goal that the administration strongly supports and we think is a critical piece of the American Rescue Plan. So just briefly, the purpose of these critical resources is, of course, to make sure that we're able to provide more support for students and to address the significant needs associated with the safe reopening and maintaining safe operations. That means that the money has to get to school districts and to schools in order to be effective. And so at the same time, there's obviously a lot of fiscal challenges that states and school districts are under. One of the ways that the American Rescue Plan addresses that is through significant separate funding for federal and local fiscal relief to help make sure that state budgets are supported and local budgets are supported during this time of a lot of economic challenges. So maintenance of effort and maintenance of equity both relate to how these funds are used in the context of the overall state and local budget. Maintenance of effort requires that states maintain K-12 funding and higher ed funding as a share of the total state budget. And so a state that plummets its K-12 funding or its higher ed funding would not be maintaining its effort for supportive education. And so that's a really important provision. Maintenance of equity focuses on what happens when there are typically budget cuts, and it protects the highest need school districts and schools from disproportionate budget cuts in those cases. So it helps to ensure that we're really targeting our resources across the board to focus on the places that they're needed the most.
So what happens if states fail to meet one or both of those expectations?
Well, we're really focused on helping states right now to meet them. And so one of the things that we'll be doing is putting out increasing guidance in the coming weeks to address both of these issues and really provide states with the information and resources that they need to understand what it means to meet maintenance of effort, and then what it means to meet maintenance of equity, and how to think about those concepts as part of their overall investment strategies.
All right, great, thank you. The law also stipulates that states, quote, respond to students' social and emotional needs, unquote, in addition to learning loss. I think you had mentioned that, Ian, and maybe Denise did as well. But let me ask you, Stephen, what sort of advice, guidance are you offering states and districts on this front?
Yeah, I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. I mean, certainly what we call unfinished learning, a lot of people are calling learning loss. We tend to think about it as you can't really lose what you didn't have to start with. But certainly that's a big thing. But I think this may be also one of our biggest challenges, in large part because we don't always pay attention to it even before COVID. There are lots of students who had trauma and dealt with all sorts of things before COVID ever happened. This has got to be a priority when we come back. It's at least as important as academics. And now we have every student. I mean, I think arguably every student has been impacted in some way by this pandemic. So what we're saying is you sort of are going to need a two-pronged approach. Obviously, we've got to have a big focus on making sure our students are supported, that the social emotional needs that they have are being addressed, that we're training teachers on how to recognize triggers, that we're training them on how to look for specific things or concerns, and then how to go about supporting them. The second prong, though, is also about our teachers. Let's face it, our teachers have had just as tough a year as anybody. In fact, arguably harder than a lot of folks. And we've got to set up structures in our schools that also support their social emotional needs so that they can turn around and help the students. Oklahoma is doing some pretty interesting things, for instance, right now around using their ACE scores to identify students who are in need, and actually hiring additional staff using some of these funds to go into the homes that students sort of disappeared during remote learning, to actually address that and find out what they need, and where, and they're actually investing that as a short-term investment to try to support or accelerate student support during the return to school. We're at the point where really we've got to kind of adopt this mentality that we can no longer have any invisible students in our buildings. Every student should have an adult they have a connection to in those schools. And that's not going to happen by accident. That's going to be something that people are going to have to really focus on putting into those plans.
I'm glad you mentioned that Oklahoma initiative, because it raises a larger question of student absenteeism, which was a serious problem in many schools pre-pandemic, but has only been intensified, as you suggest, Stephen, during the pandemic. And one solution has been to reach out in much more sort of directly than many schools have in the past to ensure that they are connected to their students and to in fact find them in some instances. But that raises an interesting question. You mentioned that the Oklahoma program or initiative is short term to find and get kids back to school, but there's also a lot of talk about hiring a lot more school staff, from social workers to counselors to more teachers. That raises the challenge of funding cliffs. The March 2020 money has to be spent by the end of September this year. The December 2020 tranche of federal funding has to be spent by the end of next year, end of September next year, and the most recent funding needs to be spent by September 2022, which is just a little over 2 years from now. Are all of you, and maybe I'll ask you first, Denise, and then ask you, Ian, to respond. Are you concerned about funding cliffs and the need in a relatively short term to turn around and lay off large numbers, thousands of people who've been hired in the short term?
I think Denise may have been momentarily disconnected, so I'm happy to start.
Yeah, jump in. And then,
you know, I think it speaks to the importance of a couple of things. One is, as we talked about, maintenance of effort. It's about making sure that the state commitment to education funding does not decline during that period. And then second is about what kinds of resources and supports we are funding with these resources over the next couple of years. You know, certainly there are a lot of urgent and immediate and one-time needs. And there are a lot of urgent and immediate and short-term needs. And then there are some longer-term needs as well. And so I think this really speaks to that process of thinking through the planning and identifying what needs can best be met with these resources, and then matching those needs with the right investments. You know, certainly students do need more social, emotional, and academic support, which requires a range of highly skilled professionals who are supported in that work. And so those are critical investments that states and LEAs should be supporting right now.
Right. Denise, were you able to hear my question? All right, so I'd love to get your thought on this. So Stephen had mentioned that Oklahoma has a very interesting initiative to reach out to students who have been absent during the pandemic, hiring folks in the short term to bring them back to school, reconnect them to the work that schools are doing. And I asked the question, well, what about more long-term consequences of hiring large numbers of new staff, additional teachers, given that we are facing funding cliffs with the federal funding?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I had bad internet service here. Look, we've been talking about this a lot, and with the amount of investment coming in from the federal government, we do think it's right to be thinking about hiring more adults to be in the classroom, to help with summer learning, to get into the pipeline even, to build a diverse educator workforce. Now is the time to do it. And let's not forget that, and hopefully Ian mentioned this, in the Biden-Harris proposed budget proposal, $20 billion for Title I, nothing to sneeze at, considering that the set aside from ARP is also for learning loss is also twice the size of Title I. So we think that we need more great adults in the classroom. We need more great leadership. But ultimately, this relationship thing that I talked about earlier, if we're going to do it right, and like Stephen talked about, if we're going to make sure that the students who need the most support are getting that support, we are going to need the staffing there to make that happen. And in our opinion, with 120 billion and perhaps another 20 billion, not to mention the money that came earlier, there should be a way to figure out how to hire more teachers and keep them on. Let's not forget the state has a responsibility there too. So we think that's the right idea.
All right, great, thanks. So I want to make sure we have some significant time for audience questions. So why don't we pivot and respond to some of those. So we've got one from—
doing that, could I add just one quick thing?
Please do.
With regard to this funding cliff, part of the guidance that we're going to be putting out is around sustainability. One of the things we saw in the funding that came after the Great Recession is people made a lot of immediate decisions that eventually there were ramifications for after the money ran out. And so as schools, districts, institutions, colleges are using this money, again, it goes back to there needs to be a real plan of identifying priorities and over a period of time, because you also don't want to be in a situation where a year from now, when this money runs out, you have to lay off a lot of people, because that can be just as bad for morale and for supporting of our students. So having a way to think about the sustainability over time that we're going to use, or just being upfront and saying, look, we're going to hire you for a year and that's all. But that is part of that planning and being overt and being clear as a leader. And I really want to push our state leaders and district leaders to hold people accountable for making those plans and for really making sure those dollars are being put where they needed to be put.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for sharing that, Stephen. So let's now turn to questions. We've got one from California. The audience member asks or says, for large states like California that rely on county offices of education for technical assistance support, how would a county office of education that is supporting districts to implement interventions using these funds receive these funds? What's the pass-through in?
So I will admit I'm not familiar enough with the California system. I think it depends if they are LEAs, then they could be directly eligible for funds. If they're not, then I think the question would be one for the state educational agency and how the SEA sees the funds that it has available for administrative costs and for emergency needs, as well as those set-asides that I described as potentially being a partnership with other educational entities.
Right, thanks. That makes sense. Here's another question. Can you talk about the possibility of using the funding for infrastructure improvements? What is permitted, just repairs, or could we also use funds to build a new community school?
So there are definitely allowable uses that relate to school facilities. And so, for example, and one that I saw asked about a couple of times in the chat is on ventilation, and that's something that is explicitly addressed. And then the American Rescue Plan also speaks to just broader uses. One of the things that we'll be doing coming up this spring is issuing a detailed guidance on use of funds that we think will be a resource for the field in being able to address some very specific questions around all the different types of fund uses. And then I would just also mention that the president has also outlined, in addition, a separate infrastructure plan. The president's infrastructure plan invests $100 billion to upgrade and build new public schools as well. So definitely a lot of focus on the urgent needs of infrastructure, both immediate and pre-existing as well.
That's helpful. And is there any relationship in the president's infrastructure plan as it affects education and needs to improve the students' academic performance? Or is there any sort of intersection between those two goals, or is it simply HVAC, et cetera, in the infrastructure plan?
So, I mean, let me speak about the American Rescue Plan, and then happy to talk at a different time about the infrastructure plan. In the American Rescue Plan, the focus is on not only meeting the immediate needs of the pandemic, but on also responding to the impact of the pandemic. And so you can envision a broad but targeted set of investments to school buildings that would fall within those purposes, and that are necessary and that meet all of the thresholds of the law.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. Is there anything specific to English language learners?
There's a lot. So as we've all emphasized, there is throughout the American Rescue Plan a focus on addressing the needs of students most impacted by the pandemic. And in particular, on thinking through the specific impact on different groups of students that are spelled out in statute, and one of those groups is English learners, and so there's a focus throughout. And in the application and plan that we intend to put out, you'll see that focus as well.
Okay, great. Here's a very specific question: is anyone considering upgrading air filters in classrooms? And I'm going to answer that and say yes. I think there's a lot of talk about that generally as part of improving the environment in classrooms as that you're talking about, Ian. Here's one. Do we have a sense of how ESSER funds are being spent, or that is the funds that have already been distributed? In particular, I'm curious about how much is being spent on social emotional supports versus academic focused supports, topic we've been talking a lot about.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there are multiple sources of data on that. So, one, there's a dashboard at ed.gov that gives the overall picture of spending of CARES Act funding from the December, all of the emergency relief funding will be housed there. Second, there's monthly and annual reporting that's done that provides a little bit of a deeper level. And then I actually think some of the richest resources are in the qualitative research that has been conducted that spotlights specific examples of how some states and districts are using these resources to address students' social, emotional, and academic needs. And so I think tying all that together, and certainly we're also focused on a set of reporting and how to deepen our understanding in a systemic way, gives a really strong picture of how these resources can be well invested.
Stephen and Denise, do you have something to add on that one?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of an offshoot to that, but I just kind of want to frame one thing. We keep talking about academics, and I think it's important that we talk about the fact that we're not talking about just reading and math here. The South, we're looking at the fact that because of automation and artificial intelligence, the workforce in the South is going to change so significantly over the next decade that we may see 18 million unemployable adults. And what that speaks to is most of the jobs that we're going to have available are going to have real STEM skill sets. And I mean, the way it's changing, advanced manufacturing is changing, welding is changing everything. And so while obviously we need to make sure students are literate and that they have numeracy and reading and math will always be key parts, we've got to make sure that we remember that science, STEM, and the other aspects of student learning are critical for them being good citizens, but also that they can be active members of the workforce. And sometimes I'm afraid when we start talking about academic achievement, we get so tied into what federal accountability state tests are that we forget that these other aspects are critical to our students, especially our traditionally underserved students who are also very underrepresented in STEM fields, that we've got to give them their opportunity to have a part of this American dream too. And that can't happen if we spend so much time just focused on math and reading that we forget about science and STEM and the other aspects of education, including languages, arts, health, and physical education.
Yep, really helpful. Denise, rather than have you answer that one, I'm gonna ask other questions of you because we've got dozens and dozens, and we're just gonna try to get through as many as we can. Thank you. At this stage of the pandemic, how much money do you think, Denise, should schools use to invest in hybrid and remote learning technology in anticipation of future potential events, as the questioner put it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. I do think as we are looking forward, where we've seen some success, isolated pockets of success with remote learning, there are some things that we can all learn from and should be thinking about as we pivot towards the future, including, some of the, sort of dynamics that have entered into the classroom as a result of remote learning, such as school discipline policies that, have ended up having children being shut out of remote learning if there's some offense, or on the flip side, a child who has been, already marginalized and experienced aggression in the classroom, not wanting to put their camera on and being penalized for that. So I think there's a lot of learning we need to do about the sort of application of remote learning, and also a lot of takeaways that we should be thinking about as kids go back into the classroom, and what that environment should look like. And then the last thing, and I speak from being a DCPS parent, I live in DC. My youngest is about to go back into the classroom at the end of April. And the one thing they've already told us is that he will need his device in the classroom, meaning that I think we can see a lot more application for devices in the new, hopefully improved classroom environment. So I think all that is to say it's not going away, and there may be more openings and closings, so we should be prepared for that. But it also appears that some systems are really thinking critically and I think innovatively about how to transition back into the classroom and use, all those different platforms in a way that really embrace and support students. So I'm excited for that. But I do hope as we do these transitions and think about the application of these new platforms, let's be as inclusive as we can. I'm very concerned about the lack of availability for our English language learners, making sure that platforms are developmentally appropriate for students with disabilities, English, and even our youngest learners. Our school in DCPS includes pre-K3 and pre-K4, and thinking about how the platforms are going to support those children while still being developmentally appropriate, that we shouldn't have too much screen time, as I'm sure
Fair
Ian
enough.
is well aware of as a father of 2 young babies. So
Thank you. Ian, one member of the audience asked, when will districts get the cash? Show me the money. I think was the question, subtext of that one.
Absolutely.
And then secondly, is early childhood being considered as a part of a sort of legitimate expenditure, to Denise's point?
Yeah, those are 2 great questions. So on the first question, we believe it needs to occur urgently and immediately. As I mentioned, we very quickly made 2/3 of every state's allocation, a total of $81 billion available to states. That sets off a clock under the statute of 60 days that states have to the greatest extent practicable, make allocations to their school districts, to their LEAs. There could be specific reasons based on state legislative requirements or regulatory requirements or others that can't occur. And what we've said is we expect states to tell us within 30 days if they're not going to be able to meet that 60-day timeline. And again, that's part of our focus on the urgency of getting these resources to where they are most needed so that they can be used right now. And on the second question, absolutely on pre-K. Supporting pre-K, protecting pre-K are critical uses of these resources.
Great. And in the same vein, can money be used to increase teacher compensation or provide bonuses as part of teacher retention efforts?
Yeah, and I think that the way that the question focuses on teacher retention is actually really important because it's a clear tie to the ways that the pandemic might be impacting the educator workforce. And so again, I would, root it in how we're thinking about the impact of the pandemic and the ways we need to support students as a result of the pandemic. And that's also something that we'll be addressing in our upcoming guidance.
Okay, great. And Denise, earlier you had alluded to innovative staffing strategies that actually incorporate technology and that have emerged to a certain extent from the pandemic. One of the few bright spots that we can point to, I think. Can you just describe 1 or 2 of those models? That is how we can, for example, make best use of top teachers in districts using technology to reach larger numbers of students. Sorry to put you on a spot.
nope, I just, I was in another window and had to click back. So a couple of things. I mean, I do think that this states and districts should be thinking more about how you both deploy teachers and paras in the classroom right now, but also as we're thinking about expanding the learning day so that we have more time to think about both social, emotional, and academics. How do you incorporate a staffing model that also includes school counselors and mental health professionals, that they are part of the entire teaching team or teaching and learning and environmental team, learning environment team, that is going to be really important over the next several years. I think that there's also going to be a lot of community-based programs out there, such as AmeriCorps, that we're going to need to bring into the the daily model of learning. So we just want folks to be really thinking about how we can have more people in the building that are directly supporting a whole child learning environment. And that means exactly the whole child. So those social workers, child psychologists, school nurses, mental health professionals are the array of staffing that we think we're really going to need to pay attention to. And I just wanted to just reflect back on the significance of what Ian said about 2/3 of the money going out now. When you think about our most marginalized students, part of the reason that they have been marginalized is because of the decisions made by leaders and other adults. And when you're thinking about those decisions, I think the key thing is this planning. If you plan well, it usually lands well. So I really encourage what Stephen said. Let's put some real thought into the planning and design and looking at the evidence base. The money doesn't all have to be spent in 60 days. And most importantly, we want the dollars, the investment, to have a real impact so that we can accelerate learning, we can catch kids up, we can re-engage students into the system and do it well, and hopefully start to really address some of these long-standing inequities. And it's the decisions that adults are making now that are going to have that kind of impact.
If I could just add to that.
Interject there too, that, one of the things that Denise is hitting on is she uses the term investment. And obviously we want to spend these funds to support our students and accelerate them to get them where they need to be. But this is also an opportunity for innovation. This is also a time where some of those things that we know have been traditionally difficult to get to because there hasn't been funding, or there hasn't been, and I know that everybody's going, well, we don't have time now either, but maybe now's the time that we carve out time. Teacher compensation is a good example of, if we want to talk about retention, it's not just about their salary. It's about their benefits. It's about their retirement. It's about their insurance. It's really about this total package of how do we recruit the best, keep the best, and put them in our classrooms to serve each child. And we've got some opportunities right now with these extra funds that are coming down for us to really think about some innovative new ways that may take a few years to pay off, but when they pay off, we end up in a better place than where we are right now.
That's helpful. Ian?
I was just going to agree with many of Denise's points and add just the emphasis on inclusive planning on the front end, of making sure that at both the state and the district levels that there is broad stakeholder engagement. That is a key part of coming up with the plans for how these funds should be used. And that is then matched with a commitment to transparency, to educational equity, and to urgency as states and districts think about the uses of these funds.
Great, thanks. I know you have to jump off right at noon, Ian, and Stephen and Denise have graciously offered to stay on for a few more minutes to answer some of the many questions we have. But before you go, let me just ask you a question, Ian, about the sort of flip side of what you've just said, which is, as a questioner suggests, what can and will Ed do to hold states accountable that are not passing down Fed funding to districts?
Yes, so sure. I mean, it starts with the information. It starts with setting out the clear expectation of when those funds will come out, having states tell us when that's not happening with clear timelines for why and when it will. And then we'll continue to work with states on a case-by-case basis. These are unprecedented resources. They are critical resources to support students in schools, and they need to get down to the district and school level in order to have that impact.
Great. Well, thanks, Ian, so much for being with us. Really appreciate it. And as I said, Denise and Stephen are going to stay on for a few minutes. So those of you who have additional questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much.
Okay, take care. let's see. A couple of people have asked questions about the concept of the community school. That is the notion that schools partner with other student and family serving agencies in their communities to address what you both have been suggesting is the sort of two sides of need during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, both the academic side and the social emotional side. What's your thinking on that? What would your recommendations to schools, school districts, and state leaders be on using resources to wrap support around not just students in schools, but around schools themselves?
Yeah, if there's anything that this pandemic has shown us is the intersectionality of it, right? Children experiencing homelessness, children experiencing food insecurity, all of which gets wrapped up as to how they engage with learning and go back into the classroom. So we wholeheartedly believe that these whole child learning supports are critical for making sure, one, that we just are able to wrap ourselves around, literally, around students this summer. Some of that may have to be online, but hopefully as more vaccines roll out, we will be able to engage outdoors and have some summer opportunities that are rich and not just focused on, or maybe just blended with learning, but offer more opportunities for students, for children to be outdoor and playing and interacting with one another. Again, I have two young children, and that the social network has just, jumped up in front of my eyes at how it's important for me, it's important for them. But I do think this intersectionality is critically important, and schools can't do it alone, and they don't want to do it alone. I think in many instances, schools want the community to engage with them and are trying to find out how to do that. So yeah, absolutely, wholeheartedly. I think whether it's it's the public health office that can engage, or figuring out how to bring the food bank closer so that kids have, backpacks to take home with them over the weekend to make sure they're still engaged. Pandemic EBT was a brave new proposal that the Department of Agriculture rolled out last year to ensure that when students weren't in school, they still were able to access the school meal benefits. Arguably, folks are having problems implementing that. A lot of it is around the data systems, but hopefully more and more states will take advantage of that. The new money that's coming out to support children experiencing homelessness. I'm sorry that Ian left because I was hoping he could give us more ideas about how they're thinking about that, because I understand it may not go through the traditional McKinney-Vento, but still $800 million to support students experiencing homelessness is going to be a big deal. But again, look, without planning, Stephen and I are saying this over and over again, inclusive planning and making sure that you're looking at the data to understand the experiences of students over this past year. Without that, I don't even think a community school will be able to be implemented well. You're still going to need that planning and the data to make it happen.
Yep. Stephen, thoughts? Are you on the same topic? Are you making recommendations to states and districts regarding using aid sort of beyond the schoolhouse door?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is where, again, like Denise said, she and I just keep hammering this. It really is about the planning aspect of it. From a little bit more philosophical perspective, especially in our rural areas, the school is the identity of the community. So why not use that? Let's leverage that to build that community support. Frankly, it actually will help the adults in the community who have also suffered trauma, who also may be looking for their own next step beyond the current situation they're in. But investing these monies in a way that leverage everything from university to school partnerships with student teaching, with providing additional supports that way, to actually creating tutoring groups within the communities, to just finding ways to support all of our students in this case, but in particular the ones of most need, to be able to provide for them a perspective of the fact that things like STEM and other things aren't just nice little enrichment activities. They're actually core to their learning. You can use your community to do so much more of that work sometimes than you can in a traditional school day.
And you could even seemingly hire someone in the short term, to build on your earlier idea, Stephen, to coordinate on behalf of the school these sorts of connections to the community.
We're all in it together, right? I mean, and the faster we realize, at SREB, we kind of jokingly say we work from pre-K to gray. We work that whole spectrum, and really until we figure out that we are really only going to have education be the real engine for recovery that it can be, it is going to take something that is beyond our teachers, principals, and staff. It's going to have to be our community. It's going to be neighboring universities, maybe even neighboring districts. I mean, career and technical education has got to play a role in our economic recovery. What if we had districts that started to partner together using some of these funds, where one district might provide certain CTE pathways, another one provides others, but using some of these funds to actually transport these students to different places? I mean, there's ways we can do this that can create innovation, but also fill the critical needs that we're going to have in terms of our workforce, but also give students a version of their own American dream that they may not have seen on their own.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, and I think actually it's a great note to end on. You're suggesting that we need to be creative, that really there are opportunities that are emerging in a time of great challenge, and that we should seize them as best and as creatively and as thoughtfully as we can. So thank you both very much for joining us. Thank Ian as well for his insight. It's reassuring that someone of his caliber, if you will, his ability, is leading this effort in the U.S. Department of Education. I think we can all be grateful for that. The webinar will be on both the SREB and Future Ed websites in the coming days for those of you who want to reprise some of it or share it with colleagues. And then we'll all keep doing the hard work on behalf of the nation's students. So thank you all.
Thank you, Tom, for being a great partner, for being our moderator today.
Yeah,
More than happy to do it.
Thank you.
All right, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That will conclude today's webinar. As mentioned before, you will receive an email with the recording link. You'll have a chance to respond to me directly if you have any additional questions. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your week.